Everyone in the neighborhood heard the buzzing before they saw it, the shrill scream of a chainsaw cutting through steel, and then the sound of the gate, our gate, collapsing into the dirt. For a second, no one moved. We just stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, watching the HOA patrol slice through what little dignity my grandfather had left. But none of us could have guessed what he would do next. You see, that gate wasn't just metal, it wasn't just bolts and paint. To Grandpa, it was the last line of defense, the one thing he still controlled in a world where everything else had been stripped away. His health, his independence, even the respect of the neighbors, they'd all been chipped at bit by bit until this gate was all he had left. And the HOA hated it. They said it violated community uniformity, that it was unsightly, that it didn't meet the approved design standards. But for Grandpa, it wasn't about standards. It was about survival. I remember standing there as the sparks flew from the chainsaw blade, each burst of orange light reflected in his tired, furious eyes. He didn't say a word, not then, but the silence was louder than any shouting could have been. The patrol laughed as the last hinge gave way and the gate toppled. They thought it was over. They thought they'd won, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because inside that garage, hidden under a tarp older than me, lay the one thing Grandpa had sworn never to touch again. The one thing he kept locked away, not out of fear but out of respect. A relic from another life. A belt-fed M60. But before we get there, you need to understand something about him. My grandfather wasn't always the old man with shaky hands and a limp. He was once the strongest person I knew. A soldier. A protector. A man who believed in honor even when the world spat in his face. He built that gate himself after Grandma died. Every bolt, every weld, it wasn't just metal, it was grief turned into something solid, something permanent. When he locked it at night, it wasn't just to keep people out. It was to hold his memories in, to remind himself that not everything could be taken from him. So when the HOA came with their clipboards and fake smiles, telling him it had to go, he said no. Quietly, firmly, the kind of no that doesn't need to be shouted because it carries the weight of a lifetime behind it. But they didn't hear him, or maybe they did and they just didn't care. Weeks passed, letters piled up, threats disguised as notices, neighbors whispering behind curtains. Some said Grandpa was being stubborn, others said he was losing it. I knew better, he wasn't clinging to a gate, he was clinging to himself. And then on that gray morning, the patrol showed up. 3 men in reflective vests, chainsaw in hand, grins on their faces like they were about to do something noble. The first cut was loud enough to rattle windows. The second sent dogs barking down the block. By the time the gate fell, you could feel the air change. I glanced at Grandpa. His face didn't twitch. His eyes didn't leave the wreckage, but something inside him shifted. A door opened. A decision was made. He turned and walked into the garage. The patrol didn't even notice. They were too busy congratulating themselves, brushing sawdust off their sleeves like heroes. But I followed him. I couldn't let him go alone. The garage smelled like oil and rust, the air heavy with years of forgotten projects. He pulled the tarp back slowly, and there it was, cold, heavy, waiting. I'd seen it only once before when he told me about the war. He said it was just a tool, that a weapon only matters in the hands of the man who carries it. And back then I thought he meant it as a warning. But now I wasn't so sure. His hands didn't shake when he touched it. They steadied. For the first time in years, his body remembered something his mind had never forgotten. He ran his fingers across the metal like he was greeting an old friend. And then, without a word, he rolled it out. Out of the garage. Out into the daylight. Right past me. The patrol's laughter stopped. Their faces drained pale. The chainsaw fell silent on the concrete. Grandpa didn't aim it. Not yet. He didn't need to. The sight alone was enough. The weight of history, the echo of every battle he'd survived, it filled the street like thunder. And I realized then, the gate was never about steel, it was about respect. And when they cut it down, they didn't just break a rule, they broke him. Or at least they thought they did. But sometimes, breaking a man is exactly how you wake him up. The street had gone silent. You could feel the weight of it pressing down, like the world itself was holding its breath. 3 men in reflective vests, chainsaw dust still clinging to their arms, suddenly looked like children who had wandered into the wrong yard. Their smirks dissolved into something. Fear. Grandpa didn't speak. He just stood there, the M60 resting across the frame of his old wheelchair like it belonged there. The sunlight caught the metal, throwing sharp glints across the patrol's faces. For a moment, it wasn't a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. It was a battlefield. I wanted to say something, to stop him, to pull him back before the point of no return, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew this wasn't madness, this wasn't rage, this was something else. It was memory. The way he held the weapon wasn't reckless. It was practiced, trained. Every movement was careful, deliberate. He wasn't threatening them. He was reminding them, reminding all of us that he wasn't just some old man for the HOA to push around. The tallest of the patrol cleared his throat, tried to laugh. "Sir, you can't just..." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Grandpa didn't raise the gun. He didn't need to. His eyes did all the speaking. Eyes that had seen jungles burn. Eyes that had watched friends fall and enemies surrender. Eyes that carried the kind of authority no title or badge could fake. I remember thinking, this is what respect looks like. Not medals, not speeches, just presence. The patrol started backing away. Slowly at first, then faster, until the chainsaw was left abandoned on the sidewalk, still warm from the cut it had made. And then they were gone. No explanation, no apology, just running footsteps fading into the distance. The neighborhood curtains fluttered shut. Phones pressed against ears. Whispers already spreading like wildfire. And there was Grandpa alone in the middle of it all, one hand resting on the cool steel of a machine that belonged to another lifetime. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. For a moment I thought he would cry, but instead he whispered more to himself than to me. "They took the gate." It was all he said, 3 words, but I felt the weight of them sink into my chest. Because he wasn't just talking about the barrier in front of the driveway. He was talking about everything, about dignity, about peace, about the invisible walls he'd built to protect what little was left of his world, and now, with the gate gone, all of that felt exposed, vulnerable. I wanted to tell him it was just metal, that we could build another one, but I knew better. This wasn't about replacing a thing. This was about losing the last piece of himself he still believed was untouchable. So I stayed quiet. I just stood beside him, the way I imagined soldiers must have once stood beside him when orders were unclear, but loyalty was not. Minutes passed, the silence of the street grew heavier, and then the sound of sirens in the distance, not loud yet but growing. Someone had called them, of course they had. I glanced at Grandpa, waiting for panic, for fear, but what I saw instead was resolve. He didn't grip the weapon, he didn't fidget. He just sat there, steady as stone, like a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. "Grandpa," I whispered, my throat dry, "you have to put it away, please, before they get here." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or stubbornness, it was something softer. "You don't understand yet," he said. His voice cracked, but it carried the kind of truth that doesn't need volume. "Respect, you don't beg for it, you don't buy it, you hold it or it's gone forever." The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flickered against the houses. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, their faces pale in the glow. The world was closing in. And Grandpa, still calm, still unshaken, whispered again, this time to me, this time for me to hear. "Sometimes, son, you have to remind them who you are." The first cruiser pulled up, brakes screeching. Doors flew open. Officers spilled out, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes wide as they took in the scene. An old man, a wheelchair, and a machine gun gleaming in the morning light. Everything felt suspended. One wrong move, one wrong word, and it could all collapse. But Grandpa didn't move, didn't blink. He just sat there, framed by the wreckage of his gate, his weapon silent but heavy with unspoken history. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't about fighting. It wasn't about scaring anyone off. It was about reminding the world that some battles never leave you. And sometimes those battles show up again, right in your own front yard. "Sir, put the weapon down." The command cracked through the morning air, sharp and rehearsed. The officers crouched behind their open car doors, fingers twitching near their pistols. Red and blue light painted the cracked pavement, flashing across Grandpa's face like a warning. But he didn't flinch, not once. He just sat there, framed in his wheelchair, the M60 resting across his lap, steady as a monument carved out of iron and will. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My mouth was dry. I wanted to shout back at the officers, to explain, to tell them he wasn't dangerous. But the truth was, even I wasn't sure anymore. Not of what he might do, but of how far they might push him. One of the officers tried again, louder this time. "Drop it now." Grandpa's gaze didn't move. His grip didn't tighten. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost too soft to hear. "They cut my gate." The officers exchanged confused glances. To them, it was nonsense, just an old man rambling, but I knew better. Those words carried the weight of every memory he'd been holding back, every indignity swallowed in silence. I took a step forward, my hands raised. "Please," I called out, my voice breaking. "He's not going to hurt anyone. You don't understand. That gate, it meant something." The nearest officer barked, "Step back, kid." His hand twitched closer to his holster. And for a moment I thought it was all going to end right there. A trigger pulled, a mistake that couldn't be undone. But then Grandpa did something none of us expected. He laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you finally see through the whole cruel joke of the world. His shoulders shook, his eyes glistened, and that old gravelly voice carried across the sirens. All this over a gate. The officers hesitated. The street seemed to breathe again. The tension cracked just a little. I looked at him, really looked, and realized the M60 wasn't pointed at anyone. It wasn't even ready to fire. The belt hung loose, the chamber empty. He hadn't armed it. He never intended to. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. The officers didn't know that. Not yet, but I did. "Grandpa," I whispered, kneeling beside him. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. Show them it's not loaded." For a moment I thought he wouldn't, that he'd stay locked in his silence, daring the world to make the next move. But then his weathered hand lifted, slow and deliberate, and tapped the side of the weapon. The loose belt jingled. The empty chamber caught the light. The officers' eyes narrowed. Confusion replaced panic. They lowered their guns just slightly, just enough to let air back into the street. "See," I said, my voice rising with desperate hope. "He's not a threat. He's just trying to be heard." The lead officer adjusted his stance, still cautious. "Then tell him to put it down." I turned to Grandpa, my heart hammering. "Please do it for me." His eyes found mine, and in them I saw the war raging between pride and surrender, between holding on and letting go. He wanted to keep it, to cling to the only thing that still made him feel whole. But he also saw me. He saw the fear in my face, the pleading. And for the first time that day, he nodded. Slowly, carefully, he lowered the M60 to the ground. The clatter of steel against pavement was louder than the chainsaw had been. Final, irrevocable. The officers surged forward, their movements tense but controlled. One of them kicked the weapon aside, another checked the chamber, confirming what I already knew. It was harmless. But Grandpa just closed his eyes. They didn't arrest him, not right away. They didn't cuff him either. Maybe they saw what I saw, an old soldier, not a criminal. A man trying to hold on to the last piece of himself. The officers pulled me aside, asked questions, scribbled notes. I answered as best I could, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. To the way he sat in his chair, suddenly smaller, like the fight had finally drained out of him. Neighbors whispered from their porches, some with pity, some with judgment, but none of them would ever understand what that moment had really been about. Because here's the truth. Grandpa didn't roll out with that weapon to scare anyone. He did it to be seen. To remind the world that even when time strips away your strength, your body, your place, your dignity is still yours to defend. And as the police finally loaded the weapon into their cruiser and the crowd began to disperse, I caught one last glimpse of him, his hand resting on the arm of his chair, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the gate used to stand. It wasn't the look of defeat. It was the look of a man who knew the war wasn't over. Not yet. The night after the standoff, I found him in the garage. The space was quiet, almost sacred, lit only by the weak yellow bulb that swung gently overhead. He sat in his chair, staring at the bare concrete floor where the M60 used to rest. The officers had taken it away, but his eyes lingered there like it was still present, heavy and alive. I didn't know what to say. What words could reach a man who had just watched his memories dragged away in the back of a squad car? So I stayed quiet, waiting. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "You know what that gun cost me?" His tone wasn't bitter, not exactly. It was something deeper, a mixture of reverence and regret. I shook my head. Everything, he let the word hang there, and nothing. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and just like that, the garage disappeared. His words painted something else: jungles, mud, the roar of helicopters overhead. I could almost hear it. "I was 19, he said softly. "Didn't know what fear was yet, or maybe I did, but I thought carrying that weapon meant I could bury it." He described it in fragments, days of marching through endless green, nights when the air itself seemed to hum with tension. The M60 wasn't just a tool, he said. It was responsibility. It meant every man around him depended on his strength, his steadiness. If he faltered, others paid the price. "Every trigger pull," he whispered, "wasn't about me. It was about the ones beside me. You learn quick dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you protect. Sometimes with your own hands, sometimes with fire." His eyes opened again, glassy but sharp. "And when I came home, nobody asked. Nobody wanted to know what it cost. They wanted me quiet, normal, smile, nod, fit in, like I hadn't left half of myself out there." His hand trembled as he gestured toward the driveway where the gate used to stand. "So I built that, steel, bolts, something I could control, something they couldn't take, every weld, every hinge. It wasn't just a fence. It was my line, my reminder that I was still me." I swallowed hard, realizing I had never understood. To me, the gate was just stubbornness, an old man clinging to rust and pride, but to him it was survival. "When they cut it down," he said, his voice low and ragged, "it wasn't just metal. It was them saying I didn't matter anymore, that what I'd carried, what I'd lost, it was all just unsightly, out of place, better off erased." His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The anger in him wasn't wild, it was focused, sharp as the edge of a blade. "That's why I rolled it out," he said. "Not because I wanted a fight, but because I wanted them to see me, to know that some things don't just vanish because a committee says so." I didn't know whether to cry or to argue, so I just listened. There was a long pause before he added, almost in a whisper, "I swore I'd never touch it again, that weapon. I kept it locked away because I thought maybe if I buried it deep enough I could bury the war too." His eyes flickered toward me. "But you can't bury who you are, not forever." The words hit me harder than I expected, because I realized it wasn't just his truth, it was a truth we all carried in smaller ways. The pieces of ourselves we hide, the battles no one else sees, the things that quietly define us. He sighed then, the fight draining out of him, and for the first time I saw not the soldier, not the stubborn old man, but just my grandfather. Tired, lonely, wanting someone to understand. "I don't have many battles left," he murmured. "But if a man doesn't stand for his dignity, even at the end, what's the point?" The bulb overhead flickered, shadows stretching across the walls. His words echoed in the silence, not heavy this time, but solemn. I wanted to tell him that dignity didn't depend on gates or guns, that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone anymore, but something stopped me. Maybe because deep down I knew he was right. Sometimes dignity isn't about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself. And when that's threatened, a man will hold the line, no matter the cost. That night I didn't leave the garage. I sat with him in the dim light, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, listening to the unspoken weight of everything he had carried. And I understood at last why the sight of a chainsaw cutting through steel could bring a soldier's memories roaring back to life. Because the war never really ends. It just waits, quiet, patient, behind the walls we build. Until someone tears them down. The morning after the garage confession, the neighborhood didn't feel the same. It wasn't the houses or the lawns or the trimmed hedges. They were all still there, perfectly uniform, manicured into lifeless submission. What had changed was the way people looked at us. Curtains twitched when I walked outside. Whispers cut off the moment I passed by. Neighbors who once smiled politely now averted their eyes, clutching coffee mugs like shields. Some looked scared, others disgusted, but none of them looked like friends. The HOA wasted no time. By noon, a letter was taped to our front door. Thick paper, red ink, words designed to intimidate. Violation of community conduct, threatening display of weaponry, mandatory hearing. I read it out loud, my stomach nodding with every sentence. Grandpa didn't say a word. He just stared out the window, watching the space where his gate used to stand. His silence was heavier than anger. "What are we going to do?" I finally asked. He didn't answer. His jaw worked, grinding some thought he wasn't ready to share. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, but the punishment started long before that. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid our sidewalk. A woman who once borrowed sugar from us clutched her child's hand and pulled her away when Grandpa wheeled onto the porch. Cars slowed as they passed, eyes darting toward our driveway, lingering on the scar of concrete where the gate had been cut down. It wasn't just isolation, it was exile. And through it all, Grandpa stayed silent, not weak, never weak, just still, watching, enduring. But I could feel the shift in him. Each glance from a neighbor was another weight on his chest. Each whisper was another cut, sharper than the chainsaw. The night before the hearing, I found him outside. The stars were dim behind the streetlights, but he was staring at them anyway, like he used to when he told me stories about Grandma. "You know what hurts the most?" he said suddenly, not looking at me. I waited. They don't even see me anymore. All they see is a threat, an old man who lost his grip. They don't remember the years I fixed their roofs or shoveled their driveways in winter or watched their kids when they were late. One mistake, one moment, that's all it takes to erase everything. His voice cracked on that last word. I had never heard it crack before. And in that moment I realized this wasn't about the HOA anymore. It was about the slow erasure of a man's place in his own community, about being forgotten while still alive. The day of the hearing, the community hall was packed. Folding chairs lined up in rows, neighbors filling every seat, their murmurs like the buzzing of flies. At the front, the board members sat behind a long table, polished smiles masking sharpened teeth. Grandpa wheeled himself in without help, his posture straight, his face unreadable. The room went silent. Every eye followed him as if he were some dangerous relic dragged into the light. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, we are here to address your actions and the disruption they have caused." Her tone was clipped, rehearsed. She spoke of rules and safety and community standards. Each word was a dagger dressed in etiquette. When she finished, all eyes turned to Grandpa. For a long time, he said nothing. Just sat there, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the table. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then slowly, he raised his head. "You think it was about a gate," he said. His voice was low, steady, but it carried through the room like thunder. But it was about respect, about a man's right to hold on to what little is left of him when the years have already taken so much. The board shifted uncomfortably. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "You cut down my gate because it didn't fit your picture," he continued. "But you didn't see what it was built from, every weld, every bolt, my grief, my memories, my dignity." His eyes swept the room, sharp and clear, daring anyone to look away. "And when you tore it down, you didn't just take steel. You told me I didn't matter, that my life, my history, my sacrifices, none of it had a place here." Silence, not the polite kind, the heavy kind, the kind that presses on your chest and makes you realize you've been blind. For the first time, I saw neighbors lower their eyes, shame flickering where judgment once sat. But the boards, they only hardened. "Mr. Carter," the chairwoman said briskly, "this hearing is not about your past, it is about your conduct. Bringing a weapon into a public display cannot be excused." And just like that, the spell broke. The crowd's murmurs rose again, half in agreement, half in doubt. The lines were drawn. Grandpa leaned back, his expression unreadable. But I knew him well enough to see the truth. He hadn't come to win them over. He'd come to speak his truth, no matter the cost. Because sometimes, dignity isn't about changing minds. It's about refusing to let the world rewrite who you are. And as the board shuffled papers and prepared their verdict, I realized this fight wasn't ending here. This was just another battlefield. One where the weapons weren't bullets or chainsaws, but memory, pride, and the stubborn will of a man who refused to be erased. The board conferred in hushed voices, their heads bent together like judges passing sentence. Papers shuffled, pens scratched, and then the chairwoman cleared her throat, the sound sharp enough to silence the room. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone cold and precise, "this association cannot and will not tolerate acts of intimidation or threats to community safety. Effective immediately, you are fined $5,000 for violation of conduct. Additionally, your property will remain in noncompliance until the removed structure is not replaced, and you are hereby placed on probationary review." The words landed like stones. Fines, probation, non-compliance, bureaucratic daggers, each one designed to cut without drawing blood. The neighbors murmured, some satisfied, others uneasy. I clenched my fists, rage rising in my chest. $5,000 for what? for defending his dignity, for daring to remind them he was still human. But Grandpa didn't flinch, not once. He sat still in his chair, eyes locked on the board as though he were staring down a firing line. The chairwoman leaned forward, her smile thin and rehearsed. "Do you understand these terms, Mr. Carter?" And then he laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't mocking. It was weary, almost gentle, a sound that cut through the polished air of the hall like a crack in glass. "I understand," he said, his voice low, steady. "I understand that you think rules make you strong, that fines make you powerful, but you've forgotten something." He paused, letting the silence gather. Every eye was on him now. "You've forgotten that people don't live in houses. They live in memories. They live in pride. They live in the pieces of themselves they refuse to give up. You can cut down my gate. You can take my money. You can call me a threat." His gaze swept the room, sharp as steel. "But you cannot erase me." The words rang out, echoing in the hushed hall. Neighbors shifted in their seats, some nodding slowly, others staring at the floor, ashamed. For a moment it felt less like a hearing and more like a sermon, truth spilling from a man who had nothing left to lose. The chairwoman stiffened, her mask cracking. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, pounding the gavel. But her voice trembled, and that tremor said more than her words ever could. As the crowd dispersed, I noticed something I hadn't seen in weeks. A neighbor, Mr. the retired mailman, stepped forward. His face was lined with guilt, his voice soft. "Carter," he said, almost a whisper. "I remember when you fixed my roof after that storm. Wouldn't take a dime for it. I haven't forgotten." Grandpa's eyes softened just slightly. He nodded once. And then another voice, Mrs. clutching her purse with shaking hands. "You watched my daughter that night when we couldn't get home from the hospital. You stayed up all night with her. I never thanked you enough." More voices followed. Quiet at first, then louder, bolder. Little stories, pieces of history the HOA never cared about. Memories of kindness, strength, sacrifice. One by one, they spilled out into the hall, weaving a tapestry of respect that no gavel could strike down. And for the first time, I saw something shift in Grandpa. His shoulders straightened. His eyes, tired but burning, lifted higher. The board tried to talk over it, tried to restore order, but the voices grew louder. Not angry, not rebellious, just human. When we left the hall that day, the fine still stood, the probation still lingered. On paper, the HOA had won, but in reality, something far bigger had happened. The neighbors who had turned away, who had crossed the street, who had whispered behind curtains, they remembered him again. Not as a threat, not as a stubborn old man, but as the man who had built this place with his hands, who had carried burdens they could never imagine. That night, as we sat on the porch, the space where the gate once stood still raw and empty, Grandpa looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "They think they punished me, but all they did was give me a chance to remind them who they are, and who I am." The street was quiet but not hostile. A neighbor waved as she walked her dog. Another nodded from across the road. Small gestures, fragile but real. And I realized something then. The HOA could fine him, shame him, strip away steel and money. But they couldn't take away the one thing that truly mattered. Respect, once earned honestly, doesn't vanish with paper and ink. It lingers quietly in the hearts of those who saw it. And no board, no gavel, no chainsaw could cut that down. Time has a strange way of moving after a storm. Some days drag on forever, heavy with tension. Others pass in a blur, leaving you dizzy and uncertain. The weeks after the hearing felt like both, slow and fast, suffocating and electric. The HOA didn't back down. Of course they didn't. They sent letters, each one colder than the last. Demands for payment, threats of legal action, reminders that Grandpa's conduct was still under review. Their words came wrapped in polite language, but I could read the venom between the lines. They wanted to break him. But something else had changed. The neighbors weren't the same anymore. Where once there had been silence, now there were small gestures, quiet, almost secret. One morning we woke to find a bag of groceries on our porch. No note, no name, just food. A few days later, a pair of young men from down the block came by, offering to help mow the lawn. Mrs. stopped avoiding us and started bringing over casseroles, saying she had too much, even though we both knew she made it just for us. It wasn't everyone. Some neighbors still crossed the street, still whispered, still shook their heads when Grandpa wheeled past. But there was a shift. Respect was stirring again, fragile but alive. Grandpa noticed. I could see it in the way his eyes softened when waved, or the way his jaw unclenched when the kids from next door offered to carry his trash cans to the curb. He didn't say much about it. He didn't need to. It was in the way his hands rested easier on the arms of his chair, in the way his shoulders didn't sag quite so low at dusk. But beneath that, something darker was brewing. His body was failing him faster now. The weight he had carried, pride, defiance, the endless battles with the HOA was catching up. His coughs grew harsher, his hands shook more often, his nights grew restless. I'd find him awake at 2 in the morning, staring out the window at the empty driveway where the gate once stood. Sometimes I'd ask what he was thinking. Most times he wouldn't answer, but once he whispered. I built it strong enough to outlast me, and still they tore it down. It wasn't bitterness, it was grief. The HOA kept pressing. Letters turned into calls. Calls turned into threats of liens and court hearings. Each envelope was another weight on the pile, and yet he never flinched. He'd open each letter, read it, set it down, and carry on. You don't fight a war by giving them your fear, he told me one night. You fight it by standing, just standing no matter how hard the wind blows. But his body didn't always listen. One afternoon I came home to find him slumped in his chair, pale and sweating. Panic surged through me, but he waved me off, insisting it was just the heat. Still, I saw the truth in his eyes. The war inside him was harder than the one outside. And yet he refused to yield. A week later, the neighbors surprised us. It was a Saturday morning, the sky bright and clear. I opened the door to find half a dozen people in the driveway, hammers, wood, and steel in their hands. We thought you could use a gate, said simply, his smile warm but resolute. Grandpa wheeled out slowly, his eyes wide. For a long moment he just stared at them, at the materials piled high, at the neighbors waiting nervously for his reaction. Then with a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Not the same, never the same." But he didn't stop them. All day they worked. Sawing, hammering, welding, sweat and laughter filled the air. And though it wasn't his original gate, though it didn't carry his grief in every weld, it carried something else. Community, memory, respect rebuilt not with steel but with hands and hearts. When they finished, the sun was dipping low, painting the street in gold. The new gate stood tall, proud, not perfect, not uniform, but strong. Grandpa reached out, running his hand across the metal. His fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from the swell of something deeper. They remembered, he whispered. His voice cracked, but there was no shame in it, just relief. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. But I couldn't shake the truth I'd seen earlier, the moment when his body gave way, when the war inside him almost won. The gate was back, the respect was stirring, but time was catching up. And no matter how strong his spirit was, I knew the hardest battle was still to come. The gate stood proud again, a patchwork of steel and sweat, not the same as the one he built, but strong in its own way. It was proof that dignity could be torn down and still rebuilt, not by one man, but by many. Yet even with it standing tall, I could see the truth every time I looked at him. Grandpa was fatting. The fire in his eyes still burned, but the body that had carried him through jungles, storms, and battles was breaking down. His hands shook more now, his cough grew deeper, and sometimes he would drift into silence so heavy it scared me. One night I found him on the porch. The air was cool, the new gate casting a long shadow across the driveway. He stared at it like it was a monument. Maybe in a way it was. "They won't stop," he said, his voice barely more than gravel. "The board, the rules, they'll keep coming, they always do." I wanted to argue, to tell him the neighbors would stand with him, that he wasn't alone anymore, but I saw the truth in his face. He wasn't afraid of the HOA, not anymore. What scared him was running out of time. "Do you ever wonder," he asked suddenly, "what people will remember when you're gone? Not the medals, not the fights, just the real of it. The pieces of you they carry forward." I swallowed hard. "They'll remember this, Grandpa, the gate, the stand you made, the respect you showed them even when they tried to take it from you." He nodded slowly, but I knew his mind was somewhere else. Far away, in jungles thick with heat and noise, in nights where survival was the only currency. The decline came faster than I wanted to admit. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed. Other days he barely touched his food. But whenever I thought the weight was too much, I'd catch him wheeling out to the driveway, resting his hand on the gate, breathing it in like it was oxygen. The HOA tried again. Another letter, another fine, another threat. This time he didn't even read it. He set it aside, eyes fixed on the sunlight spilling across the steel bars. "Let them come," he whispered. "They can't touch me now." And then, one morning, he didn't come out at all. I found him still in bed, his breathing shallow, his hand curled loosely around the corner of a faded photograph. It was Grandma, young and smiling, standing in front of the very first house they ever owned. Before the HOA, before the battles, before the gates and the chainsaws. Back when dignity came not from defiance, but from love. He opened his eyes when I touched his arm. "The gate," he rasped. "It's there," I said, my voice breaking. "It's strong. The neighbors helped. They remembered." A faint smile touched his lips. His hand squeezed mine, weak but certain. "Good, that's good." And those were the last words he ever spoke to me. The funeral was small but full. Veterans stood at attention, saluting the man they had once marched beside. Neighbors filled the pews, some with tears, some with quiet pride. Even the ones who had crossed the street, who had whispered behind curtains, came to say goodbye. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about fines or hearings or battles with the HOA. I talked about the gate, about what it meant, about how dignity isn't something you're handed, it's something you hold even when the world tries to strip it from you. And as I spoke, I saw it in their faces. They understood now. They finally saw him not as a stubborn old man, not as a threat, but as what he had always been. A protector, a builder, a man who carried respect in every breath until the very end. After the service, the neighbors gathered at our house. They stood in the driveway, circling the gate. Someone placed flowers against the steel. Another tied a ribbon around one of the bars. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't uniform, but it was beautiful. And that night, as I sat alone on the porch, the stars above bright and clear, I understood what he had meant all along. The gate wasn't about steel or bolts. It was about memory, about love, about holding on to dignity when everything else fades. Sometimes the strongest walls we build are not the ones that keep people out. They're the ones that remind us who we are. And as the wind moved softly through the bars, I could almost hear his voice again. "You can cut it down, you can strip it bare, but you will not erase me."